Hey everybody, I'm Nico, and you guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at NicoAction. That's NicoAction.
And I'm TK, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at XNateXGrayX.
And this is the first episode of the MC2 project, the first of a series of AU examinations where we're taking a look at all of the worlds that kind of are plus or minus that 616, right? We just don't want to look right into that number. It's like trying to look at the sun, right, during an eclipse or this ring light that I've got on me right now. So I want to talk about why this project, why this emission, this ejaculate, this time, right? I'm just going to go full Elle Woods on you.
I guess you did.
Yeah, always have an Elle Woods quote armed and ready to go, or any character from Miss Congeniality. So why this? Why MC2? I know I have a million reasons, but I'd love to know why you agreed to do this with me.
I mean, the big reason is because I'll just do anything with you, but really it's because we are getting to a point where we're seeing references both in the Marvel Comics universe and the Marvel Cinematic Universe come from places you never would have expected, you never remembered, and you never would have thought about. And there's never been a better time to just find the little corners and play around with them a little bit, pick them apart, see what's there that's valuable, see what's there that is absolute garbage, and just remind people that, you know, the big stories that everybody thinks about are always going to be important, but you wouldn't believe what's there hiding in the corner.
And I completely agree with that. And, you know, just to kind of relate it back to the thing that we, you know, start this kind of as a, not quite a spin-off of, but definitely a secondary project of XI4P Podcast, the show that we're a part of. I've, you know, been on the show for several years. TK's been killing it for the last few months on the show. And one of the things that we love is Phoenix and Dark Phoenix. And it's hard to forget that there was a recent Fox Dark Phoenix film. And in it, the bad guy was Vuk. And sure enough, Vuk is from the comics and appeared in Maximum Security in a Chris Claremont pen issue, no less. So it's a thing where you really never know where these stories are going to come back up or where they're going to desperately scramble to find a character name from. You just never know.
And sometimes that's an awesome thing and it's a great little reference, and sometimes it is Jessica Chastain being paid to do nothing.
1000%. But on a happier note, I want to talk about MC2 because MC2 kind of represented a funny cross-section of coming of age for me, right? Foster the People's coming of age starts playing in the background, right? So I've talked a lot about how my dad got me into comics, but I want to talk a little bit more about how I got myself into comics. And that was by finding the books that really resonated with me. And my dad, because, you know, I was 12, the fuck I was going to have like a wallet or whatever. And so my dad would buy me these comics and he started bringing me home this MC2 line. And one of the reasons that the MC2 line hit me so hard was because I kind of felt like Spider-Girl. I kind of felt like the son of a comics legend in my mind. You know, my dad got me into comics. He knew everything. And, you know, because like a good parent, if he didn't know it, he just kind of made it up. And so to me, my dad knew everything about comics. And I felt like Mayday. I felt like I was following in the footsteps of someone great at this. And I was a nerdy kid with glasses and messy hair. And I really wanted to be jacked and, you know, worked on that throughout adulthood. But as a kid, I didn't see working out as a possibility. It just didn't seem like an option for me. And here's this like nerdy kid who just magically size changes and gets to like hang out with Wolverine's daughter. So like J2 and, you know, lifelong obsession with Juggernaut being so big and jacked, right? So J2 really represented me having a place to kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of awaken some interests in like bodybuilding and in sort of changing my own body that, you know, I wouldn't come due on for many years, but it was a pivotal moment in my coming of age and understanding who I wanted to be when I, you know, ultimately did transform. And then, you know, A-Next, J2 was on it, so I would read it. But MC2 was really pivotal in me becoming a fan and doing over 300 episodes of XI4P Podcast and 100 episodes of HTML where we talk about the MCU. So this for me is coming home. This is going back to my childhood bedroom and cracking open the brown bag from Midtown Comics that my dad would bring home and tossing aside those weird looking new X-Men books and picking up those amazing MC2 books. And, it's really about having that. And I'm so excited to do this with you. Not like, oh, I could do it with anybody, but like, I'd be excited to do this with any fucking buddy. But like, and I've been excited to talk about it with people before, but like, there's something that's, we share a really personal bond that I really appreciate, that there is sort of a brotherhood in the way that like we would share our books like that. If we had grown up friends, we would have been sneaking these back and forth to each other. I don't know what sort of 1950s McCarthy era elementary school we're growing up in where they're like, no comics, but evidently that's what we're doing. So, it's the Trunbull from Matilda, and she's going to take all our books. So I guess from here, my question for you is not exactly what are you hoping to get from this project, because we're all going to get the same thing. We're going to get 225 issues that tell a very specific story, kind of over 12 years across like a dozen titles, and it's not done to this day because these characters still continue to pop up in the MC proper. So my question for you then, TK, what are you hoping to get from this next 225 issue read?
I mean, I'm thinking of this a little bit like digging up the time capsule and also looking at the sort of historical document that this represents when it comes to an idea that I think we're going to talk about a lot more, which is there was a time, I mean, there have been many times where Marvel clearly has been concerned that the ship might be sinking. They might just need to locate the exits just in case. Just in case. Projects like these really represent those attempts and that hope that if something has gone terribly awry somehow that cannot be fixed in our continuity, we have an option for using this intellectual property to continue to produce a product that people will be interested in. This is very clearly an early attempt at that, and we will talk about others and how they relate to this one, but it's fascinating to see what people believe is important and quintessential about the Marvel Universe, such that if the one that we all know and love is not going to work anymore, what do we need to pull out of it to start again?
I completely agree. I am so fascinated by the number of people who do the same thing with these tropes a number of times that we're going to talk about in this sort of history of document. So for those who don't know how I like to read comics, I like to read comics by doing a frightening amount of research. It is certainly never that I have ever come even close to doxing a human, but what I do is I index their work to that level, and it's really about understanding how the world experienced at the time of release and how that relates to how we experience it now. And so TK and I have an enormous amount of research that went into formulating this project. Now, this project is going to map out over, like we said, roughly 225 issues that were released over some 12 years. Now, it breaks down into altogether something like 39 volumes roughly. Several collections have never been released, and that's a volume of one title J2, a volume of another title A Next, as well as a number of issues of Spider-Girl. But if we were to work all that math out, it's about 39 volumes, totaling some 225, and we're going to be taking a look at them in kind of issue clusters. Now, what is the MC2? Well, the MC2 is a take on the Marvel Universe where creator, former editor-in-chief, often writer, or sometimes regular editor, Tom DeFalco imagined a world where heroes aged in real time. Now, this real-time iteration also involved a return to, sort of core Marvel Universe tropes, in very much the late 80s, early 90s. For me, I think this old school feel was meant to feel retro, but as a kid, I couldn't tell the difference between those and the trades I had of like Executioner's Song from like 1992. So I don't know. I think kind of from the outset, this initial creation point, they kind of already missed the mark.
Yeah, this is kind of one of the last, like the death knell of the completely unhip company man that is trying to write young people. Yes. With Morrison being the person that comes in and is like, no longer will I let people with absolutely no style attempt to write the people that we see having the most style in their particular universe. I will set the standard now by which if you're going to come in and write these books, you can't be a giant fucking dork. Or if you're going to be, you have to get somebody to do research for you. God love Tom DeFalco. He has no idea what a young person in 1998 was wearing. He misses the mark by 5 to 10 years, and it is glaring at points. And that's also part of what makes this fascinating. Like, this guy, this company man, this person who has produced so much content for Marvel is like, don't worry, guys, I gotcha. I'll pull this together with the young peoples. And brilliant, maybe, ideas for what that might look like in terms of process and like product, physical, actual product. No idea what he's doing in terms of concept.
I agree completely. And it's in part that they specifically did hire what were essentially older writers to do this. You know, in 1998, Tom DeFalco was already 48 years old. And that is not to say that that is too old to be a creator, but it might be too old to say, I have my pulse on what is young. And, you know, Bill Sienkiewicz, who is the finisher on this first issue that we're going to be taking a look at, the issue that started it all, What If 105, Bill Sienkiewicz was doing what was a hip take on young heroes in 1985, 1986. So by 1998, it does feel a little bit like this is maybe out of sync with what an actual high schooler would have been doing. I was in 6th grade. I have a vague almost excuse, not quite, but like it just seemed like more of the comics I grew up with. And maybe that was even the problem with hiring so many veterans for this.
To me, the stark example of this is J2 trying to put together the coolest costume he can think of, and he wraps a flannel around the waist of his Juggernaut costume, which stylistically just didn't happen in 1998 any longer. Had this story been produced in 1992 during the grunge like epic, yeah, you would have nailed it, and he would have probably been more like, you know, a misfit who was into grunge. It doesn't work. You can't even use the excuse of like, he's nerdy, he doesn't really quite get it. It's just a complete miss, and it is this stark part of his costume that you see in, you know, on covers for the first few issues. It's all over the place.
And it's so funny because, you know, you're saying that it's 1992, and my first thought was, no, they still did this in when they did it in Clueless. They pointed out that those were the grunge stoner kids that were like, this is not who
and even
this
that was
is.
94. That was, you know, that's being produced in 94. So like,
truly,
you know, by 98 we're moving into Britney Spears in sync territory.
Yeah,
you want
definitely.
Parachute pants, you know, you want a Juggernaut that decides to frost his tips for no reason.
Yes.
But it's, you know, there are reasons why somebody might be wearing a flannel like that, and I could have bought it if the person writing it had the idea, because they knew what young people were doing and were trying to play around with that in some way. The last time Tom DeFalco considered a young person was 6 years previous in 1992, and this is what he went with.
I very much agree. And, you know, when we're talking about kind of putting this in a context of what was going on in the Marvel Universe at the time, that they said, what if we need a way out? You know, there's a pretty famous quote that when Bendis was asked to write Ultimate Spider-Man, he believed he would be writing Marvel's final #1. That's what dire straits the company was still facing when Ultimate Spider-Man launched. And that's a stark realization. But when I take a look at the month that the MC2 debuted with Spider-Girls #1 and 0, along with J2 #1 and A Next #1, we had the Uncanny 360 and X-Men 80 relaunch period where everybody that left Excalibur came back to the team, and it had those badass foil covers, and it was like, you know, the Hunt for Xavier kind of era, and it was one of those, oh look, somebody who grew up with the all new, all different X-Men is ready to write them now. And so it had that was kind of like an okay minute for X-Men going on. I remember that time pretty fondly. I don't know if you do.
I don't. And this is something, you know, it's funny that you mentioned sort of your coming into comics with MC2 being like a big onboarding point for you. For me, it was the leaving point. It was not that specifically, but I had started to slow down after Onslaught. Something about Zero Tolerance, I just wasn't really feeling it. I was still really invested in Generation X because they were my teens, but I'm starting to notice that book is having the same problem that MC2 is having, which is that nobody who actually understands teenagers is there anymore. And slowly I'm just realizing I'm getting older. I no longer have that childlike fascination with superheroes. I'm needing to engage at a more critical thinking level, and nothing is showing up for me in Marvel. And MC2 was kind of emblematic of that. Like, there's nobody here that wants to talk to a 13 going on 14-year-old about like the true terrors of going into high school. school. It's all like, I get you, cool kid. Here's Juggernaut in a fucking flannel around his waist. And that's when I started to, get into things like Vertigo and just move into other territories again until Morrison shows up and really is able to bridge that gap. Morrison is not a particularly like, hey, teens person. He's like human beings of all types will respond to my insane stories. It doesn't matter how old you are. And that was kind of what I needed. And MC2 really was emblematic of the fact that absolutely was not going to happen for a little while.
Well, and it's really funny that you say that, because as you're saying it, like, I'm realizing once at like 14 years old, I was much more concerned with meeting cute boys than I was super concerned with grabbing my brown paper bag from my dad. That's like, you're starting to go out, you're starting to have friends that can like drive you to the mall, and then you can like hang out at the mall afterward, and then you can like hang out afterward. And so I had reached a critical point where, just a year after you, we're about a year apart, just a year after you, I really, I jumped off by the time the second wave of titles ended. I did not actively read anything after that. My dad kept bringing them home, and like, if I had like a day that I was homesick, I really do very much identify with what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, this was a tough time. Comics are so different now in terms of what kids can get out of them, and that standard is getting close to 20 years old at this point, so I don't think people realize the degree to which in the late 90s we were really being told, if you age out of this, that's not our problem. We're just going to work on the next generation of kids.
Yeah, and to that end, there actually are several generations represented in this first month's sales. Now, while I don't think that sales represent everything, I think they represent how, at least at this point in time, Marvel dealt with math on financing and purchasing and releasing. So it's of note that the only book that outsold the Uncanny and X-Men relaunch was Battle Chasers #1. And it only outsold it by a little bit, end of the 90s, made sense, Battle Chasers, whatever. But the Uncanny and X-Men, I'm shocked by this. Their difference of sales is about 4,000 units, which feels steep to me, but Uncanny sold about 142,000 units and X-Men sold about 138,000. The only numbers I really want to mention from here are that Spider-Girl #1 would sell 63,000 copies, which is less than a half of the lower selling X title, and was still considered a hit. That's of note. And that's not the only sales for X-Men and Uncanny X-Men that month, as those were just the holo covers. There were then the regular standard issue covers, and that's before we even get into Dynamic Forces and variants. This was just that the holo and the standard were both offered as regular versions and had to be counted twice.
And these aren't great numbers historically for the X-Men, like, overall.
No, these are end of the 90s Marvel having trouble.
Yeah.
From there, we have Avengers 9 of the Kurt Busiek run. Kurt Busiek, George Perez. If you say a bad word about George Perez, you can't be on the show. And we have Wolverine 129, Fantastic 410. We're definitely in a heroes return era where we're seeing some weird runs. Mutant X #1 was also released this month. So talking about AUs, we might want to take a look at. We had an event going on over in Spider-Man with issue 440, but I don't know that I've ever seen Amazing Spider-Man sell 64,000 copies in regards to X-Men selling 140. Like, that feels like an impossible number, because the reality is Amazing Spider-Man 440 was only one position ahead of Spider-Girl. At this point, your precious Gen X kids were running around on issue number 43, which ranked them at the 24th bestseller of the month overall. Now, speaking of multi-generational kids, X-Force came in at the number 29 position with 82 here on the top charts. Now, it's also of note that they both sold less than Spider-Girl, so keep that in mind. And inexplicable what the motherfucking fuck is somehow X-Man is ranking in at the 32nd position with his 43rd issue. And I don't know that, did people still know that X-Man was a thing in 1998?
I did sort of fail to mention that one, that I was still reading, because I am for some reason a simp for Nate Gray, for whom I take my Twitter handle.
Hey, I respect it. I have no judgments there. I just went on about how J2 helped me realize I want to lift weights. So we're good,
Yeah, I mean, Nate, terrible run of comics all the way through, and this is really where we're not. And I feel like it was some, like, people were just like, I don't know, there's X-Man on the cover. I have now purchased it. Like, it's like some sort of like spell that they just put on comics purchasers where they were like, I got hypnotized and I bought X-Man.
I just kept buying it it because it had the right letters in it.
Right, exactly.
Now, of note is right around that position are the aforementioned final issue of Excalibur, right? The team came back to the main title. So Excalibur ended with 125 issues, finalizing at the 38th position. Now, the best-selling Marvel titles on either side of that are in the 36th position, A Next #1, and in the 48th position, J2 #1. It is important to remember forever that J2 is kind of the unwanted baby of this initial run. It is never a seller. To this day, J2 has the most issues missing of any of these books percentage-wise on Marvel Unlimited. Half of J2 is still not on Marvel Unlimited, so it's interesting. Now, I do also want to point out a couple of other titles where you might be like, at this point, Daredevil ends with issue number 380, putting it at the 97th bestseller. I need to point out that J2 sold almost twice as many issues for his first issue as Daredevil sold of his final issue.
And how far off are we at this point from the Daredevil movie?
2-3 years. The guy who would come on to revamp Daredevil in the next months, Kevin Smith, of course, would have a cameo in the Daredevil film, playing some sort of like autopsy doctor. I don't know what his character's name was, so we're just gonna call him Autopsy Doctor. And it's terrific. So, kind of back to MCU, right? Because we were talking about the world of 1998 at Marvel that sets up the reality of what's going to come with MC2, right? So now that we know the playing field we're in, I want to talk for a moment about the previous playing fields Marvel attempted this with. Now, well before there was MC2, Marvel had the dream of maintaining multiple lines, and it has always been some kind of mess. I don't want to call them all failures because a lot of people will attack me for saying that about 2099, but I do want to mention that none have ever been so strong that Marvel kept them around for much longer than a decade. And I would love to know your relationship with these previous attempts before we jump into the explanation of them.
I mean, I was all in on 2099. I was exactly, the right age. The thing I was talking about before where you're just like, we got to catch the kids and like get into something the kids will like. I was the right age for that with 2099, where I was just like, what's the future going to be like? I gotta know. And, the fact that there was no sort of point to be made out of the story, none of that mattered to me. I was just into the 2099 and thinking about what the future could be. The fact that none of the characters were especially compelling, it was new powers that I'd never seen before. That also sort of started to get me into like Spider-Man 2099, which I then retroactively got into Spider-Man. It was a big, it's a smaller investment for me to learn about Punisher 2099 than it would be to go buy Punisher comics right now. So I'm going to get into this and work my way back. They really sold.
Okay, I accept that. I really do. I feel like I was a little too young for 2099, and because my comics were purchased for me, because, child, one of the things was like if my dad didn't read it, I didn't read it. And if it didn't have easily accessible trading cards, I didn't know it. And there was no Wikipedia, there was no Marvel Unlimited, and there was no trade library. So let's take a look a little further back than 2099. Let's say February of 1977, when Marvel decided to take a look at consistently twisting its canon with the release of the first ongoing What If title. Now, I need to point this out, just to strengthen our previous argument. What If number 20 was written by Tom DeFalco in 1980. By 1998, he doesn't feel like the guy to launch a series of books about kids, It just puts an odd spin on how far apart the ideas should be, right? And I think there was maybe something about What If that people really like, because there have been no less than 250 issues called What If out of Marvel across multiple series, multiple volumes, tons of one-shots. Oh man, so if you try to index them, it's just a nightmare because every What If one-shot gets its own damn name. Now, I know What If was like the cartoon du jour for the summer, but how did you feel about What If, the title itself?
I mean, to me, What If stories are such a smart play for Marvel in terms of you always ask yourself these questions. What if Dark Phoenix Hadn't Died on the Moon is the most important thing an X-Men fan who goes back and like knows their X-Men history will probably ever ask themselves. Every single author who I've ever loved on the X-Men, I would read their version of What If Phoenix Hadn't Died on the Moon. There is no shortage of stories to be told in the What If universe. So to me, it always makes sense. And then to me, I also always see the cynical aspect of like, well, of course you can sell more issues of this.
And it's worth noting that in the process of doing all of this research, one of the things I, of course, looked up were the sales figures on everything. And this book, this What If that launched everything, What If 105, it sold 29,000 copies. We're talking about books selling 150,000 copies. You know, there's an excruciating outlier, and I'd need to look up the number month it came with again. But, you know, most of these best-selling months are 150, 150, 180, 170. There's one month where it's the Darkness #1, and it's like 350 south. Like, it's just nuts. It's just such an astronomical spike. But so then we're talking about a world where comics can sell literally 10 times what If 105 sold. That must tell us that they cost so little to produce, that they're not hard to make, and that any return on them is then a victory.
The flip side of that is like sometimes they're just not going to be very interesting stories, but it never hurts to throw it out there. And unfortunately, What If 105, like the concept isn't staggeringly interesting. The idea that any superhero would become an adult and have a child is not really even a what if, it's a when.
Yeah. I mean, like by this point, that was already the basis for what is to this day considered, you know, and it's one of those things where like, as everybody's like, hey guys, I'm reading my 11th Alan Moore comic and every 6th word is rape, right? When you get to that point and you're like, let me check out this Sandman book instead, right? I feel like that's what's like culturally happened over the last 20 years. And now, you know, we're at a point where everybody's just sort of like, oh, Sandman is the comic book. There weren't comics before Sandman. That's all retcons. And so I feel like we're already talking about a world where the crux of that comic has to do with parentage and how succeeding your parent is such a crucial element of, you know, the wheel of time. So we're already talking about a world where the most critically acclaimed comic of ever is about this. So it is a little bit like, yeah, it's not the most original idea, but it maybe doesn't need to be.
Well, you know, of course it doesn't need to be. People will pick it up. Is it going to be the thing that sells 200,000 copies? Probably not. Can you launch an entire universe off of it?
Ultimately, I don't think they could. And I love this as a series of trades. I really do. I love this as a series of trades. Reading this and like, because it reads real fast, except when it reads really slow, right? The pages that feel like a Twilight book about a young lesbian who loves basketball are
she's not a young lesbian. She's 35 years old. She herself has 2 children and has just realized I've been living a lie this whole time. The design on Mayday Parker, I will never for a single moment again, it's like the J2 thing. You do not understand how children work. Yeah,
She looks like Nancy McKeon in the later seasons of Facts of Life. And it's just like, Bill Sienkiewicz was not the guy to draw young, cool, edgy Britney Spears kids.
I think they thought they were giving us T-Boss. Like I saw the short hair and the overalls and I was like, this is who they think they were giving us. They did not.
White TLC. That's exactly what Spider-Man needed.
Yes, precisely.
So, man, I love that. Okay. Well, speaking of things that totally missed the point, Marvel had a second major attempt at forming another universe, and this was, of course, the New Universe. And the New Universe was 1986's, like, okay, so for everything that is that good, there must also be a thing that is that bad. Otherwise, the thing that's that good doesn't have anything to balance it out on the cosmic spectrum. And if 1986 gave us Born Again and Elektra Assassin, it also gave us New Universe. And New Universe was a gritty, realistic take. And their main quote was, it's the world outside your window. That was their whole thing. And a quote from Archie Goodwin is, there would be no hidden races, gods, mythological beings, magic, or super technology, which was was a rule immediately broken by all of the titles. And it's so strange because time also operated in real time. Every month of publishing was a month of the book. And had you had any experience with New Universe?
No, my first experience of New Universe was Warren Ellis did
New
a thing with
Universal.
it. Yeah.
La Roca.
I read that, thought it was completely bewildering, and kind of forgot about it before I even remembered what I was reading. And then it was in the Hickman stuff.
Yeah.
And that is when I had to sort of go back and sort of try and understand if I'd thrown out a really brilliant concept. And that's why I laugh so hard when it's like the world outside your window, because the New Universe stuff that Hickman picks up is so cosmologically insane on a degree that even Marvel regular most of the time does not reach, that the idea that the base concept was like, this is just normal stuff, is fucking hilarious.
Well, that's actually the problem. They went with this whole, it's the world outside your window. It's the normal day that you look at. And they were like, oh, this won't have superheroes. It'll just have gritty stories. And so they didn't realize that what's actually fascinating about a universe is watching it come into being, right? In whatever form it's going to be. You want to see a transformation moment. And there were a handful of titles that ran more than a year, and then a handful that ran less. We had DP7, which ran 32 issues plus an annual. Justice, which I want to say ran 32 issues, but I need to point out that like the first 12 are revealed to be a hallucination, and then from then on, the book is about a serial killer. And the fuck. And then there's Kickers Incorporated. It's like hard to get through that book's name. Kickers Incorporated, which in 1986, that book that I'm already saying the name is kind of like, ooh, is by Tom DeFalco and Ron Friends. Ron Friends being Tom DeFalco's. Yeah, oh yeah, I'm a kickist. I'm the kickiest. My friends and I are kind of like, you want to have a kicky? All the time. So now, if you guys thought that Kickers Incorporated was a little tough, and like, I'm not mocking the material, and names change and things that make a good name change. In retrospect now, Kickers Incorporated, it's just not a name that's aged well. That's all, right? Mark Hazard, Merc, ran 12 issues plus an annual. Night Mask ran 12 issues. Cyforce got the DP7 treatment and ran 32 issues plus an annual. Man, these names are tough. So then comes the toughest name. It's a real toughie. We have Spitfire and the Troubleshooters for 7 issues, which becomes Spitfire for 8 and 9, and then becomes Codename Spitfire for issues 10 through 13. And then lastly, we have Starbrand, which after I think issue 12 became the Star Brand, and it also received an annual and ran a total of 19 issues. For all that we're saying, the world outside your window. No, it was always going to be that they were all secretly related to a paranormal event. Yeah, that paranormal event was called the White Event, which would also be a major focus of New Universal. Now, I have an amazing quote from the Wikipedia, and please understand that I think that Wikipedia is as scientifically accurate a source as my foot is a telephone. So I'm not looking for exactitude here, but if this, this does match the facts. So in an effort to save the line, DeFalco, now Marvel's editor-in-chief, Grunwald, referring to Mark Grunwald, John Byrne, and editor Howard Mackey ended up removing some of the more fantastic elements from it, and in a few cases, doing radical revamps. Byrne signed up to write and do breakdowns on the Star Brand, altering the series to focus less on Kevin Connell and more on the power of the object itself. This began initially with the idea of having Ken Connell go public with his identity as Star Brand. Similarly, the premise of Justice was revealed to be a hallucination that had artificially induced the title's protagonist by another paranormal, and then from this point on, he's a serial killer who targets paranormals who abuse their powers. Okay. Some of the characters whose titles had been canceled return as backup features. How do you say in an effort to save the line, right? But then there's a conflicting quote a little bit further down the wiki that says, despite all of this, the imprint was discontinued in 1989 after a total of 170 comics had been published. That's 170 comics in 3 years. The Spider-Girl MC2 universe does 225 in more than a decade. So New Universe really churned them out. Now, it follows with, readers often assumed that the New Universe had suffered from poor sales, but in fact, all series were solidly profitable right up until their cancellation. The actual reason for discontinuing the line was that with Marvel Comics in one of its most successful eras, it was felt felt that the staff and production resources would be better used on new, more promising series. I don't know who to believe there, that the line was so rough it needed saving or that it was thriving. But either way, it does not sound like the new universe worked out so well.
And the proof is kind of in the retrospective. We don't really look back on that era of the new universe with any kind of fondness. Any of the work that has been done to pull that stuff into modern times has been an insane feat of narrative wizardry on the level that only Jonathan Hickman can do. This is not something that gave us like the iconic anything.
They've gone and made it iconic since.
Right. It's the iconicness of Starbrand only came out of Hickman's Infinity, Secret Wars, all of that stuff, and has developed since then, but nothing about it at the time is anything we remember fondly.
Well, but speaking of things that people remember fondly, I do want to point out that there is a secret connection between New Universe and your favorite, 2099. So let's start with what 2099 is. 2099 began as Stan Lee and John Byrne doing The World of Tomorrow. Then they changed the name to Marvel 2093, as it was meant to be 100 years later, and decided that 2099, just sounded more edgy and 90s. And I get it does. Now, the series was meant to depict one possible future of the MU, but of course, throughout the years, they've said it's definitive or it's not the definitive. Now, obviously, it can't be the definitive because it can't, but it also has its own Earth numbering, so it definitely can't just be our future. Anyway, the big problem with 2099 wasn't that it wasn't good, it's that it all wasn't good. Some of it was very good, and some of it was very uneven. Now, the sales were uneven across the line, and what many people don't realize is that 2099 had like an overarching story through all of the titles, including President Doom, which led to all of the books getting an AD symbol. Now, I don't know if you saw it in my notes. Did you see when 2099 actually ended?
No.
Okay, March 1998.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
That seems like
too late or too
4
early
years
for you?
too late for me.
Oh, no. I mean, like, the X-Men stuff had gotten unreadable long before that, but there were really popular, like Punisher 2099 and Spider-Man 2099 were really popular.
So that's a really interesting discussion. Now, they were, and some of them remained popular way through the end, but Punisher 2099 ultimately became a really low seller, and they used a line-wide event to kill it off. Now, I don't want to count the one-shots because the one-shots are uncountable. There were 2099 one-shots. But the core titles were 2099 Unlimited, which ran for 10 issues, 2099 World of Tomorrow, which ran for 8, Fantastic Four 2099, and Doom 2099 kind of have numbers you wouldn't expect. Doom 2099 ran for 44 issues, while Fantastic Four 2099 never clicked with fans and only ran for 8. Ghost Rider 2099 ran for 25, whereas Hulk 2099 really never got off the ground at 10. Punisher 2099 and Ravage 2099 ran 34 and 33 respectively, and it's of note that Ravage began as Stan Lee's 2099 title, and he jumped off after just a handful of issues. Spider-Man 2099 is, of course, the big one, running 46 issues plus an annual, several specials. Now, many people do fondly remember X-Men 2099, which ran 35 issues, plus a special and then another special called Oasis, but they might not remember the short-lived 6-issue X-Nation partner series that was by popular demand. At times, 2099 had viable hits with Spider-Man and X-Men. It's that everything else kind of started to pull on it after a while.
And the stories could be good, but it was immediately clear that the universe was not good. This was not an alternative to the 616 where you were going to be interested in these big events, that the overarching stories that were happening. You were into X-Men 2099 because the characters were kind of cool and you wanted to know what was happening there, but it wasn't like, you would read standard X-Men books and then discover, a Daredevil crossover and start to get into Daredevil. It was really difficult to get into the universe as a whole.
Now, I love that you say that because that really was the case. Originally, there were only 2 points of intersection. Funny enough, Daredevil is one of the heroes who met someone from 2099 in an issue of Fantastic Four. Additionally, there was a Spider-Man meets Spider-Man one-shot where they flip places, and that was very popular, but 2 books is not enough to sustain a line, and 2099 Manifest Destiny ended the series in 1998. Hey, wait a minute. What if 105 came out in January January of 1998, and the line kicked off in November of 1998. I can't help but feel they said we have room for one line that takes place in an artificial future that we can't sustain. So
I
that's
mean,
my
or the
guess.
flip side of it, whoops, this attempt is tanking. Quick, churn another one out as quickly as possible.
Oh, yeah. And they did. They did before it even ended. Because we can't really say that the only attempts to reboot the Marvel Universe involve whole new character sets, while many do. One particular, very divisive one featured everybody's favorite characters. Heroes Reborn was one fucking fuck of a fuck. And, the Jason Aaron Heroes Reborn that we covered on this show that I love so much was so silly. And like many Jason Aaron stories, to accept how great the great emotional stuff is, you kind of have to accept the ridiculous. And I feel that for many people, a vast majority of the original Heroes Reborn kind of lacked some of that emotional realism. From the wiki, for this reworking, Marvel farmed out the properties to some of their former freelance artists who had ceased working for the company in order to form Image Comics. Of course, they're talking about the Image boom that took place back in the early 90s, where all of the biggest names left everybody and formed their own company. Here we see Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, who had Wildstorm and Extreme Studios, farmed out Fantastic Four and Iron Man and Avengers and Captain America, respectively. Now, I don't know if it's actually Marvel's claim of low sales on Captain America that they fired Liefeld. I think it was just the negative criticism for how bad the art was received. Genuinely.
It's that shot of his body, that side profile of his body that is just a refrigerator box. It's so reminded us all at the time when we didn't need it. What about Rob Liefeld was actually not that great. And, we got caught up in the moment in the early 90s X-Force boom, and we're like, oh, this guy. But once you step away from it for a second and then are put back in front of it, it just, oh God, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth.
It does. It stings. Like, that's the problem, I think. And ultimately, Marvel did feel the same way, asking Jim Lee to take over all of the titles. And he did for a while. And then ultimately, they were like, if we keep this contract going, you need to be even more hands-on. And he was like, no, thank you. So instead, the titles all got an additional 13th issue, despite all of the contracts being for 12. This was written by another Gen X veteran, James Robinson, who would write World War III, which included Marvel and Wildstorm properties. Very exciting. And then after that, everybody came back in Heroes Reborn: The Return by, Peter David and once again Salvador Larroca. So Salvador Larroca did New Universal with Warren Ellis, and Peter David did Spider-Man 2099. This is getting to be creepy. It's like we're saying all the same names are responsible for all the same stuff all the time, and that is why a number of these attempts don't go anywhere, because it's the same new thing every time.
Company men.
Of course, it is of note that any discussion of attempts to create a second universe, if you don't discuss the Ultimate Universe, you're kind of being a joke. It is, without a doubt, the most successful any company has ever been with a project like this. My notes literally say, for all this vaunted, my notes are so complete, my notes literally say the Ultimate Universe, LOL. Because what else can you say? Ultimate Spider-Man is, to this day, one of the most legendary comic runs of all time, and to be one of the most legendary 20 years later, that's a really unique distinction. That's enough time for people to find all of the flaws in your work. That's enough time for people to have forgotten you for better things. But Ultimate Spider-Man is the standard. Miles Morales might be the most significant character to come out of Marvel outside of Kamala Khan in decades.
There is a Miles Morales video game.
Yeah. Were you an Ultimate guy?
I was, yeah. I had been sort of away from the X-Men for a while and picked back up during the Morrison run, and it was really because I was in love with the Invisibles, and I was just kind of playing around with, like, as an adult, am I into comics? What can I sort of find my way into? And eventually I just found out I missed comics. I missed the X-Men, and I went back to reading them at a time where, some stuff was great, some stuff wasn't. And the Ultimates got brought to my attention. I still think the first 3 volumes of Ultimate X-Men are really solid.
Okay.
If you are really saying, like, I want to take the quintessence of these characters and make something current, I think it succeeded in that.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't think that, the writing didn't blow my mind or anything, but as a project, as a reboot project, I thought it succeeded in that basic goal incredibly well.
I have some relationship problems with Mark Millar's work.
Yes.
So so I think that's always kept me back a little bit. I think one of the most interesting things is the decline of the Ultimate Universe is such a steep and severe trajectory that is a little difficult to miss. You know, with Bendis in charge of Ultimate Spider-Man, you had over on this side of the aisle, Millar in charge of the Ultimates and Ultimate X-Men. And that's kind of a double whammy for then Millar to leave Ultimates and Hitch to then leave Ultimates. And yet that's when things got gritty and violent is kind of interesting. You know, for many people, the Ultimates 3 and Ultimatum and the shift to Ultimate Comics really marked a huge mistake. I think it actually chases back a little bit further. Everybody here knows that I'm a big Mike Carey fan, but Ultimate Fantastic Four's crossover as a fake out for me was the first moment where they put the quality of not contaminating the Ultimate Universe in jeopardy.
I think you're absolutely correct about that. I think the problem, the root problem, the seed of the rot goes back even further than that. And it is in this promise that we're going to do this all again. And if there's not going to be any complex continuity, we're going to be able to onload new people, which is a promise that you can never keep.
Never,
if you
ever.
cannot figure out how to get people excited about complex continuity and make that an asset instead of something that you're promising that people won't have to deal with, your project will have failed before it begins. And, you know, Bendis did an amazing job, some fantastic stories in Ultimate Spider-Man, but 6 issues in, it has its own continuity that is going to get complicated. And they're still launching books with that idea that, like, this is different. You're not going to have the same problems that you have with our 30-year-old titles. Yes, you are. You're always going to. They're not problems. They are features. They're not bugs. Figure out how to sell them. Don't promise something you can't deliver.
And that's one of the reasons that I love that we recently covered on, you know, of course, the partner show to this XI4P podcast. We recently covered Iron Fist by Alyssa Wong. And I specifically commented as we were prepping for this, Iron Fist did this right. There's a ton of backstory. It's a character that people aren't even familiar with who's got backstory. So now she's got to explain the backstory for you guys to know this character you know nothing about, even though you have 30 issues you can pick from right now. And then on top of it, she still manages to weave in all of the elements that make Iron Fist Iron Fist. So, you know, I think when you're talking about the difference between you don't need the baggage continuity and you do, it really is about celebrating the baggage continuity.
Yeah, you're not going to suddenly make somebody a comic book reader who hates the idea of what comics are. You can't sell to that person. These are comic books. Give up on them and, you know, work on the MCU. That's what those people will get into, and that's also completely fine. But this idea that, like, we have this shameful albatross around our necks, which is the work that dozens of creators have done over decades. It is a feature. It's not a bug. Sell it or accept that some people aren't going to buy it. Not every product can be universal.
I completely agree. And that's one of the reasons that maybe perhaps the Ultimate Universe was never for me, because once Bendis got going, right, you had, and this was just like a little cursory glance that I really wasn't a big Ultimate Universe person. So I have a long running comic book series, Kid Riot, which second volume Riot Squad. So, you know, we've got like some 50 issues, and our main artist, Taran, he is a huge Ultimate Spider-Man person. And he would explain to me that, like, oh, well, when you should get it in the hardcovers though, because that puts like Ultimate 6 where it goes, and it puts like Ultimate this and that and the annuals. And I'm like, what the fuck? And like, I thought this was supposed to be easy. And then I'm like looking a little bit more into it, and I'm like, ooh, Ultimate Iron Man. Oh, Arson Scott Card. And then I'm like, oh, so poorly received. It is ultimately revealed to be an in-universe TV show about Iron Man instead of being the actual Iron Man story. And like the changes between Thor in Millar and Hitch's Ultimates, and then the new iteration of Thor, which, don't get me wrong, avoiding Thor spoilers as best I can, like that hammer showing up in Thor is one of the greatest moments in comic book history, bar none, ever. It is, yeah. So I love that moment, and I think that there's so much about Ultimate Universe that gets so messy, and like, I love Squadron Supreme. Speaking of AUs, my precious Supreme Power and Squadron Supreme by JMS, who was responsible for the reboot on Thor, responsible for the reboot on Spider-Man that picked the book back up sales-wise, right? That, that crossed over with the Ultimate Universe in Ultimate Power, which I'm still not sure how to read, and I have the whole thing.
One of my favorite details from the Ultimate Universe that speaks to what I liked about it and what I hated about it is Spider-Woman, Jessica Drew, is just another clone of Peter Parker that was made female. And it's a neat thing, but like already having said that, that is a continuity twister that, again, like this just, writers are going to write what they write and it's always going to get complicated. There are some really cool ideas and there are so many moments in the Ultimate Universe that you're like, that's great writing. It's not an alternative to the same type of writing that happens in the 616, but it's cool.
I very much agree. It could never replace it for me. And one of the things that they noticed very quickly as the Ultimate Universe was succeeding was maybe it's just easier to do this with the original properties. And you got JMS Thor, and you got JMS Spider-Man, you got New X-Men by Grant Morrison, you got Bendis's New Avengers, which of course begat Alan Heinberg's Young Avengers. You had reimaginings of the Fantastic Four by Jonathan Hickman. You had so many things where they said, what if we take this and we make it a moneymaker? And Bendis's Daredevil, it might be shades of Miller, but it's still very unique shades. So I think one of the big problems that MC2 faced right away is what we just said. If you want to tell me that the Uncanny 360 team and the future timeline that creates is the same thing as the new X-Men team, no way. Absolutely no way. And that's just about a year later. That's 394 with the, really famous cover of Jean and Logan making out. And you got Poptopia. And then before you know it, you're at the 400s and Mystique is, hey, you know what? Thinking about it, maybe we should revisit Poptopia at some point because somebody does some fucked up shit to Banshee and Mystique's out there trying to kill people and there's an X corporation. Maybe my precious Poptopia Uncanny is better than we remember. I could talk about it all day. But what I want to talk about a little bit more is the setup for our MC2 read. It's so funny because we were originally not going to do this episode, but, TK being the smartest big brother's ever been was like, there's so many notes here. Maybe there's a conversation to be had. And, I'm skipping tons of this, like in my notes, and there's still so much to talk about that goes into the trajectory that led us to MC2. When you think about the creators like Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz, they worked on every fucking property at Marvel. Paddle Leaf, Ron Lim, maybe not as many, but still a significant number of works. These aren't slouches. It's not that Marvel brought in their worst guns. It's just that Marvel brought in not the right people to launch a young book. I mean, it literally only captured me for 1 year at 12. And then all of a sudden I was like, boys, give me boys, right? Like you were already there. So it's really funny that we haven't even started talking about MC2 as a line. And we're already talking about a number of its failings.
Yeah, because, as we talked about with the Ultimates, they're kind of baked in. This is what we're seeing at the time of MC2 is comics as a business and as a medium is changing. And MC2 is one of the last through lines of the same people, the same culture that started all these books and started all these stories, passing down from one person to the next in a very direct connection. DeFalco is one of those people. He is tied to the people that came before him very directly. He is tied to the company Marvel Comics. He is tied to Marvel as it was. And Marvel is at a point right now where it needs to change, not just in terms of like, we need a change in story ideas. We need a fundamental change in what's going on in comics on a number of levels. And DeFalco simply was not that person. It doesn't mean he's a bad writer. It doesn't mean he doesn't have good ideas. It just means he can't be responsible for structural change in how comics and its readers interact. That came later.
And you're blowing me away because I'm going to add some stuff that's not in my notes. And it references Daredevil by Bendis yet again. It's important to note that we said a little bit a while ago in this episode that Daredevil 380 was released at the same time as Spider-Girl 1. Now, Daredevil 380 was the final issue of the original series, and it closed out that run, which was followed by Kevin Smith's relaunch under the Marvel Knights imprint. The Marvel Knights imprint was another attempt to farm out major characters, much like Heroes Reborn, but instead they used a guy named Joey Q and his studio and Joe Quesada success with the Marvel Knights imprint is literally what got him editor-in-chief. Now, to mention a thing that many people don't realize that Daredevil did with an issue 0 back in Kevin Smith's run. So we're talking 1998, 1999. There was an online digital issue, and that was Joe Quesada's thinking back around this time. So yeah, you're really talking about exactly what it was. They saw these guys were not thinking about the next thing, and then they saw someone who was. And that's, I think, in many ways why one of the things we have to discuss is that Spider-Girl was almost canceled, like seriously no less than 4 or 5 times. And I think it's because Joey Q felt like he inherited a mess that he didn't want.
I think you are probably exactly right about that. And I think that he did not see anything in there that was something that his way of thinking about comics could capitalize on.
Oh, yeah.
There's just nothing about it that... And actually, it turns out there are a few things that are going to come much later with some distance, and a lot of it is just kind of nostalgia.
Yeah.
But there
totally.
really wasn't anything for him or the crew that he was bringing in, or the real new ideas that were starting to come out that was like, we can work with this. We can make something out of this.
And it's so funny because we're talking about a world where comics is changing. And I worked at a comic shop in 04 and 05. And one of the big things was, as I worked there, the trade piles got higher and higher. And we had to clear out more and more space for more and more trades. And it went from the trade wall to the trade walls to the trade room. And then it was trade subscription. And we really transformed in that year. And even though Spider-Girl launched in 1998, Spider-Girl launched in a world where Marvel was doing reprinting issues 0 through 2 in a special big guy, which they would occasionally do for the next years. You know, they did it with NYX, which I'll never forget the time when they were like reprinting the massively popular NYX 1 through 3. And I'm like, you guys know that it's not until 4. Don't. So, you know, the trades don't start till 04. By the point at which Spider-Girl enters Digest, we are on issue 75 of Spider-Girl. That entire universe has come and gone, like completely. And just to put a couple of numbers to some things, I've built out a vague timeline, and without reading the whole thing, this universe roughly launched in October of 1998. Now, Wizard was so about this. Wizard released an issue 0 for one title in January of 1999. That would be Wild Thing, Wolverine and Elektra's daughter. Another thing could have only been birthed of this era. And then there was Spider-Girl 1/2, which both of these do see release in the trades. Spider-Girl 1/2 is released in October of 1999, celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the MC2 imprint. Now, it turns out all of these were intended to be 12-issue maxi series, but Spider-Girl was so popular, they kept her running. And after they ended J2 and A Next with issue 12, I just realized J2 A Next. They have the same name. Letter, the thing that follows. Interesting. They launched Fantastic 5 and Wild Thing, both of which end with issue 5. Now, there would be 2 3-issue miniseries in 2000, running till the beginning of 2001, The Buzz and Dark Devil. But after that, it's just Spider-Girl. And she runs for so long that in January of 2002, with her 40th issue of her properly numbered series, but her 42nd issue overall, Spider-Girl overtakes the total number of issues of all other MC2 titles combined. That's insane. Now, Tom DeFalco, who we can't stop saying his name, like at some point, I'm just gonna have to start breaking out into Rock Me Amadeus because I'm saying Falco so much, right? Falcon Punch. So Sean McKeever actually wrote a fill-in issue, Sean McKeever of Sentinel fame. Those of you who might not realize that Runaways was actually part of an era of attempting to bring in younger readers to Marvel called Marvel Tsunami, which gave us the birth of the great Joe Chen cover, as well as Runaways, Mystique, Sentinel. I feel like I'm forgetting 1 or 2 Tsunami books, but they were all kind of cute, kind of fun. And Sean McKeever was responsible for Sentinel, which was a great book, super great. And Marvel gave it a number of tries, just never caught on, but certainly wasn't Sean McKeever's fault. Now, we wouldn't get more MC2 tie-ins until if you look at the numbers, it is unfucking believable how successful Last Hero Standing was. They give Spider-Girl a weekly event, her own Secret Wars, in August of '05. And like, I worked at a comic shop in August of '05. We could not keep this book on the shelf because we didn't expect to have to order that many. And the worst selling issue of this miniseries outsells the best selling issue of Spider-Girl for like 2 years on either side of it. So of course, you know what they had to do. Do it again. And you know what happened? It tanked. And Last Planet Standing sells nothing. And it and Spider-Girl both end. Spider-Girl with issue 100, Last Planet Standing with issue 5. It was a miniseries. In September of '06, there's a second era, which sees 30 issues of Amazing Spider-Girl plus an issue 0, 5 issues of A Next, 5 issues of Fantastic 5, plus 5 issues of American Dream. But ultimately, nothing can save the line. And come May of '09, Spider-Girl sees Amazing Spider-Girl end publication with issue 30. But, of course, this is not the end of the MC2 universe. We've talked about a lot of things, but what haven't we talked about? That's right. What if somebody said, Tom DeFalco, if someone gave you the opportunity to bridge when you started the MC2 to the beginning of the MC2 in the Marvel Universe, would you tell those stories? And he said, well, fuck yes, I would. And we got Mr. and Mrs. Spider-Man. And Mr. and Mrs. Spider-Man tells how to bridge the Marvel Universe from when MC2 started to the start of MC2. This ran in the background of a Spider-Man family. And TK, do you know what happened then, TK? No. Fans demanded they bring Spider-Girl back. So they canceled Mr. and Mrs. Spider-Man and replaced it with more Spider-Girl. Now, you called it. Instead, they launched it as Spectacular Spider-Girl Online Exclusives. And she ran 11 online exclusive issues before fan demand was so popular, she got moved into Spider-Man Family and Web of Spider-Man. And they said, no fucking more! And they gave Tom DeFalco a 4-issue miniseries, Spectacular Spider-Girl, from July of 2010 to October 2010. And then they released Spider-Girl The End. And that was it for a minute. Because that's when they said, let's bring her back. And we got Secret Wars, then we got Spider-Verse, and as I was doing research, I'm like, oh, but she can't be important. The MC2 universe is so central to a bunch of Spider crossovers. These characters are major players in super multiversal Destiny stories. These characters, even crazier, they had Tom DeFalco come back to write some of these stories. So I think what I'm trying to say is the MC2 universe can't be stopped, no matter how few people wanted it in the first place. And I say that as someone who did. So I just read a lot of notes. How do you feel having heard everything we just talked about as we set out on this journey?
I mean, it is proof that there is something there. Like, there's something here worth paying attention to. I don't know what we'll be able to take away from it and what we'll be able to sort of understand about the nature of truly great characters. Because even after hearing all this, I still don't feel like Mayday Parker is one of them. And yet clearly there is something important that we're going to dig into.
Because people keep coming back to her.
Yeah.
And it's like writers. It's not like, Nico goes up to his comic shop and is like, hey, where's the new Spider-Girl issue, bruh? And they're like, gotta write to Marvel. And I write to Marvel and I'm like, bruh, where's Spider-Girl? It's like, no, she's in Spider-Verse and she's in Secret Wars. And like, she plays a significant role. She gets ongoing minis. That's such a stupid thing to say, but like, there are some sort of regular minis that occur within like spider cycles, right? Spider-Geddon, Spider-Verse, Spider Too Many Spider titles, and she appears in those regular cycle of minis. So
this is a character that has very real possibility to have somebody famous voicing them in an animated Spider movie. That's insane.
She could be in Spider-Verse. She could be into the Spider-Verse 2 and 3.
Yeah.
And she could be like a person.
Yeah.
And I would be fine with it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things though that I really do want, and I feel kind of bad saying it, is I want to get the stink of the late 90s off of her. Because one of the things that this book felt like from moment one was the Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire in a very, we're trying to capture, like, it's not like film quality, it's not color scheme, and maybe it's the palpability of like a tasteable zeitgeist when a certain color hits your memory in just the right way. But like, there's kind of like a blah and like a brown and kind of like a to even the stuff I love about like the Very Brady sequel and like the Spider-Man movies, like that certain 1996 to 2002, there's a heaviness that hangs on a lot of that media that I feel like this carries with it in abundance.
It's the idea of give me a ton of low quality stuff and let me sift through it to find the good stuff worth doing, which now, like, you know, with things like YouTube, anybody can make a video series and 1,000 of them are going to be terrible and one's going to be interesting and we'll sift through to find it. In 1996, not anybody could make a series, but a lot of people were behaving as though their ideas didn't really matter. Just let me throw anything out there. So you got all this stuff that was really low quality, and yet it was the only option for what it was.
There's a rote condition to it, right? Like one of the things that birthed the Sentai machine in the United States was a need to use a factory reset on every episode so that you didn't feel contaminated by inability to use footage. And, you know, that's how you don't realize that it's the wrong costumes for the wrong Rangers for so long. And, you know, as a guy who is, you know, a big Jew Ranger guy, like, you know, these are shows that I really love, you know, I want to recognize the good in them, but I still see how they had to follow a beat sheet because they were beholden to existing footage. And that playing back into comics is actually really dangerous because dangerous maybe is a severe word, but comics weren't beholden to by existing footage. They could be whatever they wanted. So there was no reason to feel locked in. And certainly Marvel was taking some chances at this time here and there. They were doing things like Marvel The Lost Generation, which had a backward countdown number, which again, just like Grant Morrison, Invisibles Volume 3, right? There was also stuff like Fantastic Four Silver Surfer Dominion Factor, where it was multiple minis covering the same story, but like you read the 3 Fantastic Four issues and the 3 Silver Surfer issues, but then like you could cross them over together, but they could still read separately, like stuff like that. So they were still taking chances, but you know, not in the way that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's totally true.
So the last thing I really want to bring up is we've talked a lot about the arc of these sagas, the overall kind of success or failure of these lines as they exist. And it is without need to say that Spider-Girl, of course, has the best-selling issue of the MC2 line with her debut issue, number 1. Not quite her debut issue, I guess. So her eponymous debut issue with Spider. Hey, that makes her like Spider-Man because he debuted in Amazing Fantasy. So like, it's cute that she debuted in What If. Okay. So Spider-Girl's best-selling issue is 62,805 copies, man, back to the number, right? When the MC2 line finally throws in the towel, Spider-Girl's final regular issue of publication sees sales of just 11,810 units. Spider-Girl The End kind of got a spike from being a The End title, selling about 16,000, but the books that contain Spider-Girl go as low as Spider-Man Family, selling just over 7,000 copies. Now, things are pretty dire on the other titles as well. American Dream, the final non-Spider-Girl issue of the Spider-Girl MC2 universe, sells just over 10,000 copies.
It's like the little engine that could, but it actually can't, but it is
It can't.
somehow
It
still
actually
going.
can't.
It's not like the engine's actually running. It just found a hill and
Yes.
it's just going downward, but it's not stopping somehow.
It's no one's stopping it either,
Right.
is the thing. Like, there is nothing stopping the trajectory of Spider-Girl up through her ending. And it's so funny because a lot of the titles of her arcs are kind of generic at first. They're like Avenging Allies and Endgame, because that is a generic title, guys.
Yep.
I'm sorry, Russos, because I'm sure they're watching. So, you know, and then it's stuff like Games Villains Play. But by the end, the titles of these stories are like Brand New May, May Break. Yikes. So we do wind up in a position where by the end, this was an older crew of creators telling an older story as it approached kind of a place where we maybe didn't need it anymore. And, you know, I don't know that the Ultimate Universe proves that that's not true. I think the Ultimate Universe proved there were some really cool ideas left to say, but the fact that by Secret Wars, the Ultimate Universe was done. You know, the MC2 line certainly only running 225 issues over 12 years Don't get me wrong, Ultimate Spider-Man ran 225 issues in 15 years. So I'm not pretending that we can even compare these two things. This is, once again, my foot is not a shoe, but I meant phone. But I just said rubber band back to that earlier joke. Thwip. That was me just thwipping the earlier joke to myself.
Pulling it back in. Reel it in.
Reeling it real fast. I'm really excited to do this. I've already read the first 30 or something in preparation, and I've done my notes on the first 19 or whatever, first 20. And God, some of these are bad. And they're objectively bad. I feel like if I sat down with the creators, they would say, yeah, this was a swing and a miss. Because it's exactly what you said. They were churning out as much as they could. There was a sense that if we just keep making the art, someone will buy it. But, the me that goes to the gym every morning, that, messages you my bench records, that messages you, oh, I hit this new PR. That guy can still remember seeing that scene of J2 in the bathroom becoming a fucking colossus and not knowing what to do with the many reactions it caused. And part of me still remembers, spoiler alert, the reveal of who the first Venom host is in this Spider-Girl story. That issue is the best thing in this first 20 issues. That is such a fucking fraught issue. It's taut as hell. It is exciting. It is clever. And that issue, I could give that to anybody and they would be like, yeah, okay, this might not be the best universe, but I get this, right? Everybody doesn't love Desperate Housewives, but anybody can appreciate Bang, okay? So it's sort of that, it's whereas I kind of feel like everybody could find something they love about Twin Peaks, but I can't get most people to find anything to like about Firewalk with me. It's one of those things where you gotta already be into Twin Peaks to like Firewalk with me. The story where J2 shows us how to self-defend from his bully by transforming into the Juggernaut and nearly killing the guy. That one does not feel like one I could just pull off the shelf. That's kind of like a Firewalk with me. That's are you already in this far? Then this is probably something you enjoy, but this is not a surface grab.
What am I trying to say here? What it comes down to is man, ideas are so cool. And it's so great to have new ideas or spins on old ideas that feel new. It is so cool to find every single facet of the infinite gem that is a character in comic books. It does not mean once you have found it, you should commit it to any form of permanent publication and try and give it out to the world. But, if nothing else, it gives us an opportunity. If it's there, we can play around with it a little bit and maybe find something that, even though I feel like it never should have been shown to you, now that it's here, we're going to show it to you again.
Because here's the thing. If we had gotten 12 maxis, I meant 12 issues, but yeah, if we gotten 12 maxis, 12 separate 12-issue series, I probably would have been a little bit more fulfilled if it had changed and bounced around, but it also would have taken new characters. I do want to make one other comparison. I brought up how I felt Alyssa Wong's Iron Fist channeled this MC2 spirit with a ton of BDE. But conversely, I can't speak to whether or not Vita ever read Spider-Girl numbers whatever, but Vita Ayala's Children of the Atom, and I only say that it belongs to one creator as opposed to as well as the many incredible artists that were attached to it, because it was so many incredible artists. It actually has a lot that reminds me of this. There's edgy infighting and basketball and some amount of coming of age and storytelling about powers, and there's a classic feel to the art and a throwback atmosphere. So while I don't know that I can speak to that's definitely their experience, it does kind of line up in some ways that maybe this would have been around a time they were reading. And if not, this is just one of those synergistic things where eventually, because whether or not this is Tom DeFalco's shining moment, Tom DeFalco is a legend and is amazing and has done a lot of incredible things. So it could just be two great minds reaching the same ideas. But there is something that I do see channeled in books today from these pages, for sure.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely correct about that. And writers are always going to look at a character or at a property or at a little corner of the Marvel universe and not just put their own spin on it, I'm just going to write my Daredevil story, but really try and pull something and say, I want to create a truly unique attempt at examining the essential qualities of a spider person, of an X person. And a lot of times they're going to look like this. It's a new character. It's a new version of the universe, and let's see what we can play around with from there.
I love that. And I can't wait to play around this more with you, or play around you more with this, play around more with you, whichever one gets me to get to play with you all the time. So I can't wait to do that. And until we do, where can everybody find you?
You guys can find me on Twitter and Instagram at xnateXgrayX.
And as always, you guys can find me and TK as well over on XI4P Podcast, where we're celebrating over 300 amazing episodes talking about the X-Men and now the Marvel Universe at large. You guys can also find me over on Twitter and Instagram at NicoAction. That's NicoAction. And don't forget, I can't believe I get to say this, but you guys can check me out in the upcoming Young Men in Love comic anthology featuring myself and incredible talents like Anthony Oliveira, Terry Blas, Sina Grace, Joe Glass, and more. You guys can order that from Diamond Comics using APR 221275 or from your local LCS. And until next time, when we finally dive into the first volume of all 3 titles, that's Spider-Girl 0 through 5, J2 1 through 6, and A Next 1 through 6, we'll see ya.
Bye.